The Willowbrook hepatitis experiments. Imagine being a parent with a disabled child in 1956. You need help. The state institution has a waiting list of thousands. But then a doctor tells you there's one way to get your child in immediately. The year was 1956, and the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island was supposed to house 4,000 children. It held over 6,000. Most were kids with intellectual disabilities whose families couldn't care for them. The conditions were horrific. Feces on walls, chronic understaffing, and hepatitis was everywhere. Nearly every child contracted it within their first year. Dr. Saul Krugman saw an opportunity. He was chairman of pediatrics at New York University, a respected virologist with federal funding. He wanted to study hepatitis, and Willowbrook gave him access to hundreds of potential subjects. Parents desperate for care were told the regular wards were full, but the hepatitis research ward had openings. The implication was clear. Participate in the study, and your child gets in. Over the next 14 years, between 700 and 800 children were deliberately infected with hepatitis. The method was simple. Researchers took live hepatitis virus and mixed it into chocolate milk or milkshakes. The sweet taste masked what was happening. Children drank it down, unaware they were consuming a disease that would make them sick for weeks. Later, when mixing it into drinks wasn't efficient enough, they switched to direct injections. The infected children were isolated in a special ward. Researchers drew their blood regularly, monitored their liver function, collected stool samples. Some received experimental treatments. Others were left untreated, controls to measure disease progression. The children experienced the full course of hepatitis. Jaundice turned their skin yellow. Fevers spiked. Their bodies ached. For weeks, they suffered from a disease that was entirely preventable. Krugman's research did distinguish hepatitis A from hepatitis B. It contributed to vaccine development. But 700 children were deliberately infected to get that data. In 1967, Dr. Stephen Goldby published a letter in the medical journal Lancet calling the experiments unethical. The comparison to Nazi experiments was made. Slowly, criticism mounted. The experiments ended in 1970. Not because of legal action, not because of regulation, simply because the public pressure became too intense. Dr. Saul Krugman faced no criminal charges. No civil lawsuits succeeded against him personally. He continued his career at NYU without interruption. In 1972, just 2 years after the experiments ended, he received the John Howland Award from the American Pediatric Society, one of pediatric medicine's highest honors. In 1983, he received another award from the U.S. Public Health Service. Until his death in 1995, Krugman defended his research. His argument was consistent. The children would have gotten hepatitis anyway at Willowbrook because the disease was endemic. They received better medical care in the research ward than they would have in the general population. Parents consented, and the research saved lives. The Willowbrook experiments didn't directly result in new laws, but they became a defining example in the growing movement for research ethics reform. They were cited in landmark 1972 articles about medical ethics. They influenced the creation of stricter informed consent requirements and helped establish the institutional review board system that oversees human experiments today. While Krugman's experiments did contribute to our understanding of hepatitis, one has to ask, was deliberately infecting 700 disabled children the only way? The thalidomide disaster. In 1957, a German pharmaceutical company released a miracle drug that doctors promised was completely safe for pregnant women. It was marketed in 46 countries. By 1961, it had killed an estimated 10,000 babies. The drug was called thalidomide, developed by Kami Grunenthal in West Germany. The research director was Dr. Heinrich Muchter, a former Nazi doctor. The company claimed they'd done extensive safety testing. That claim was false. Thalidomide was marketed as a sleep aid and treatment for nausea. It had dozens of brand names: Contergan in Germany, Distaval in the UK, and over 40 others worldwide. Doctors prescribed it enthusiastically, especially to pregnant women suffering from morning sickness. They were told it was completely safe. It wasn't. Thalidomide crosses the placental barrier and interferes with fetal blood vessel formation. If a woman took it between days 20 and 36 of pregnancy, often before she even knew she was pregnant, the effects were catastrophic. Babies were born with phocomelia, a condition where limbs are absent or severely shortened. Some had flipper-like appendages instead of arms and legs. Others were born without ears, which meant they couldn't hear. Some had eye defects that left them blind. Many had heart defects, kidney malformations, and digestive system abnormalities. Approximately 40% of the babies affected by thalidomide died within their first year of life. The estimates vary, but somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 pregnancies were affected. 5,000 to 10,000 infants died. In Germany alone, 5,000 to 6,000 thalidomide babies were born. In the UK, over 2,000. In Japan, over 1,000. In Canada, between 100 and 200. The United States was largely spared. A single FDA doctor named Frances Kelsey repeatedly refused to approve thalidomide for the American market. She kept requesting more safety data. The pharmaceutical company pressured her relentlessly. She refused. Only 17 thalidomide babies were born in the U.S., all from experimental distribution before FDA approval. In 1960, doctors in Germany and Australia started noticing something strange. They were seeing cases of phocomelia, a condition so rare it normally occurred in 1 in 100,000 births. Suddenly, it was 1 in 100. Dr. Widukind Lenz in Germany and Dr. William McBride in Australia independently began investigating. They interviewed mothers. They looked for patterns. Both identified the same link: thalidomide. On November 15, 1961, Dr. Lenz presented his findings to Jaime Grunenthal. On November 26th, the company withdrew the drug in Germany. Other countries followed over the next several months. The company initially denied any link. They continued defending the drug's safety for months even after withdrawal. In 1968, a criminal trial began in Germany against Jaime Grunenthal executives. It lasted until 1970. The trial ended without a verdict after the company agreed to pay 100 million Deutschmarks to fund a compensation foundation. No one went to jail. In the UK, families sued Distillers Company. After intense public pressure and a campaign by the Sunday Times, the company settled for £28 million. Again, no criminal convictions. The thalidomide disaster led to the 1962 Kefauver-Harris Amendment in the United States, which required pharmaceutical companies to prove both safety and efficacy before approval. It established mandatory reproductive toxicity testing globally. It created the modern drug safety monitoring systems we rely on today. Dr. Frances Kelsey received the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service from President Kennedy in 1962 for blocking thalidomide's approval in the U.S. And here's something that might shock you. Thalidomide is still prescribed today for leprosy and certain cancers, but with strict pregnancy prevention programs. Except in Brazil, where over 100 new cases of thalidomide babies have been born since 2005 because adequate safeguards aren't in place. The Guatemala syphilis experiments. For 64 years, the United States government successfully hid the fact that American doctors traveled to Guatemala to deliberately infect orphans, prisoners, and psychiatric patients with syphilis. The experiments only came to light in 2010. The year was 1946. World War II had just ended. Dr. John Charles Cutler of the U.S. Public Health Service needed to test whether penicillin could prevent syphilis after exposure. He couldn't do the experiments in the United States. So he went to Guatemala. The Guatemalan government cooperated. Dr. Cutler had oversight from senior officials, including Surgeon General Thomas Perrin. This wasn't some rogue operation. It was a federally funded U.S. government research program. Between 1946 and 1948, approximately 5,500 Guatemalans were involved at various levels. 1,308 people were deliberately infected with syphilis. The victims were chosen because they were vulnerable. Female sex workers, male prisoners in the National Penitentiary, soldiers, psychiatric patients in the National Mental Health Hospital, juvenile detainees, and children in the National Orphanage, ranging from 6 to 16 years old. None of them could provide meaningful, informed consent. Most were illiterate. The psychiatric patients were mentally ill. The children were children. Dr. Cutler started by paying female sex workers who had syphilis to have intercourse with male prisoners. If a woman didn't have syphilis, they infected her first, but the infection rate was too low, not efficient enough for research purposes. So they switched methods. The researchers created open cuts and abrasions on people's genitals, faces, and arms. Then they applied syphilis bacteria directly to the wounds. Sometimes they abraded the penis, then rubbed infected material into the raw tissue. They also used direct injections of the bacteria. They infected people with gonorrhea and chancroid as well. The exact methods used on the children in the orphanage remain unclear in public records, but children were deliberately exposed to syphilis. Treatment varied by experimental design. Some infected subjects received penicillin. Others received inadequate treatment. Many received no treatment at all. The researchers were testing prevention and cure protocols, which meant some people had to remain sick. The symptoms of untreated syphilis are painful. Genital lesions, open sores, systemic infection that causes fever, rash, and fatigue. Left untreated, syphilis can cause neurological damage, cardiovascular damage, and eventually death. 83 people died during or shortly after the experiments. It's difficult to establish whether the deaths were directly caused by the syphilis infections or by the subjects' underlying health conditions. Many were already ill, but 83 people died. The experiments were never published in medical journals. Dr. Cutler kept personal papers, which he archived at the University of Pittsburgh. The U.S. government never disclosed what had happened. In 2010, Dr. Susan Reverby, a medical historian at Wellesley College, was researching the Tuskegee syphilis study. She found Dr. Cutler's archived papers. They contained detailed records and photographs proving the deliberate infections in Guatemala. On October 1st, 2010, the U.S. government officially acknowledged the experiments. President Obama issued a formal apology to Guatemala. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called the experiments reprehensible. A presidential commission investigated and confirmed the findings in 2011. Their report was titled, "Ethically Impossible." In 2012, survivors and family members filed a federal lawsuit against the U.S. government. The lawsuit was dismissed. The court cited sovereign immunity. The government cannot be sued without its consent, and statute of limitations. No criminal charges were possible. Dr. Cutler died in 2003, before the experiments were exposed. The other researchers were long dead. No one faced trial. In 2015, the U.S. provided $5 million for healthcare services in Guatemala. It was not labeled compensation. It funded healthcare improvements and STD treatment programs in affected communities. No individual victims received direct compensation. The same Dr. John Cutler, who ran the Guatemala experiments later, worked on the Tuskegee syphilis study from 1951 to 1972, the Fernald School radioactive oatmeal experiment. Boys in a Massachusetts school for the feeble-minded were told they'd been selected for an elite science club. The membership prize? Radioactive oatmeal, courtesy of MIT and Quaker Oats. The year was 1946. The Fernald State School in Waltham, Massachusetts, housed boys labeled mentally retarded. These were children whose families couldn't care for them or whose disabilities made them wards of the state. Researchers from MIT needed subjects to study mineral absorption. Specifically, they wanted to test whether Quaker Oats absorbed iron and calcium better than competing cereals. The Quaker Oats Company was funding the research. The Atomic Energy Commission provided additional support. The lead researchers were Dr. Clemens Benda, Dr. Robert Harris, and Dr. Konstantin Maletskos. They had the authority of MIT behind them and access to a captive population of vulnerable children. They selected 74 boys between the ages of 10 and 17. These were the higher functioning residents, boys who could follow instructions and participate in activities. The researchers told them they'd been chosen for something special: the Science Club. Being selected for the Science Club was presented as an honor. These boys would get special privileges: trips to baseball games, visits to the beach, Mickey Mouse Club membership, special meals and treats. For institutionalized children who received little individual attention, this felt like recognition. Letters were sent to parents requesting permission. The letters mentioned a special study. They emphasized nutritional research. They highlighted the privileges their sons would receive. What the letters didn't mention was radiation. They didn't mention radioactive tracers. They didn't explain that their children would be fed radioactive iron and calcium mixed into their breakfast cereal. Many of the parents were illiterate or had limited education. Some boys were wards of the state with no parents to consent. The distinction between nutritional study and radiation experiment was never made clear. The procedure was simple. Researchers mixed radioactive iron 59 and calcium 45 into hot oatmeal and gave it to the boys at breakfast. They also prepared special milkshakes with radioactive tracers. Over 7 years, from 1946 to 1953, the boys regularly consumed radioactive substances. The researchers drew blood samples to measure absorption. They collected stool samples. Some bone marrow samples were taken, though the extent of this remains unclear. The doses were relatively small. The radioactive iron was approximately 0.03 microcuries. The calcium ranged up to 57 microcuries. The researchers claimed these levels were within safe limits according to Atomic Energy Commission guidelines. The boys didn't experience acute symptoms. There was no immediate radiation sickness. But the long-term effects of radiation exposure are difficult to establish. Radiation increases cancer risk probabilistically, not certainly. Some participants later developed cancers, but establishing causation decades after exposure is nearly impossible. The boys kept their science club certificates for decades. They displayed them proudly. They thought they'd been selected because they were special. In 1993, journalist Eileen Wellsome was investigating Cold War radiation experiments. A Department of Energy task force was reviewing declassified documents. The Fernald experiments were identified. When the experiments became public in 1994, Massachusetts formed a task force to investigate. They documented the experiments and found that informed consent had been inadequate and that vulnerable populations had been exploited. President Clinton formed an advisory committee on human radiation experiments in 1994. Their final report in 1995 condemned the practices at Fernald. In 1995, survivors filed a class action lawsuit against MIT, Quaker Oats, and Harvard University. In January 1998, the case settled for $1.85 million, divided among the survivors and estates of deceased subjects. Individual payments were approximately $60,000 per person. The settlement included no admission of wrongdoing. MIT issued a public apology in 1995. President Charles Vest said, "I am profoundly sorry." But the researchers involved were already retired or deceased. No criminal charges were filed. The boys who thought they were special learned 40 years later that they'd been fed radioactive breakfast cereal to help a corporation prove their oats were better than the competition. The pellagra experiments on orphans. A government doctor in 1915 had a theory that could save millions from a deadly disease. But first, he needed to watch orphans slowly starve. Between 1900 and 1940, pellagra killed over 100,000 Americans, primarily in the South. The disease caused 4 symptoms so consistent they were called the 4 Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. The medical establishment believed pellagra was an infectious disease. Dr. Joseph Goldberger of the U.S. Public Health Service disagreed. He believed it was caused by dietary deficiency. To prove his theory, he needed to induce the disease through controlled starvation. Goldberger conducted his most well-documented experiment on prisoners at Rankin State Prison Farm in Mississippi. He offered 11 volunteer inmates pardons in exchange for participation. They were fed a corn-based diet lacking meat and vegetables for 6 months. Most developed pellagra symptoms. The governor honored his promise and released them. But Goldberger also experimented on orphans. The exact details are less documented than the prison experiments, but historical records indicate he conducted dietary manipulation studies at orphanages in Mississippi and surrounding southern states. The specific institutions' names remain unclear. The total number of children involved is uncertain, but likely dozens across multiple facilities. The children were institutionalized orphans with no parents or guardians to consent on their behalf. They had no advocates. They couldn't refuse. The experimental design was straightforward. Some children were maintained on a varied diet as controls. Others were given a restricted diet, mimicking the poor southern diet that caused pellagra in endemic populations. Heavy corn, cornmeal and hominy, minimal meat, limited vegetables. The diet lacked what we now know are B vitamins, specifically niacin. Pellagra symptoms typically develop within 6 to 8 weeks of a deficient diet. The early symptoms are weakness, fatigue, and loss of appetite. Then comes the dermatitis, painful skin lesions that are rough, scaly, and darkened, especially in areas exposed to sun. The gastrointestinal symptoms include diarrhea, nausea, and inflamed mucous membranes. The neurological effects range from confusion and disorientation to depression and anxiety. In severe cases, dementia develops. How far Goldberger allowed the symptoms to progress in the children before intervention remains unclear. What is documented is that once symptoms appeared, he gave the subjects an improved diet. The symptoms reversed, proving that pellagra was caused by dietary deficiency, not infection. There are no confirmed deaths directly attributable to the orphanage experiments. Pellagra can be fatal if untreated, but Goldberger reversed the disease once he'd proven his point. The fate of the individual children afterward is unknown. No long-term follow-up studies were conducted. They presumably returned to the regular institutional diet. Goldberger faced no criminal charges. The methods were legal in 1915, decades before modern research ethics standards existed. He gained professional recognition and was promoted within the U.S. Public Health Service. He died of cancer in 1929 at age 55. Posthumously, he was honored with awards and recognition. The National Institutes of Health named a building after him. His research eventually led to the identification of niacin as the preventive factor in 1937. By the 1940s, mandatory flour enrichment with niacin effectively eliminated pellagra as a major public health problem in the United States. His findings saved countless lives, but those lives were saved by deliberately making vulnerable children sick. Goldberger's experiments occurred 32 years before the Nuremberg Code and 64 years before the Belmont Report. They didn't directly lead to ethics reforms because they predated the entire framework of modern research ethics. They're examined retrospectively as examples of what was acceptable before we understood why it shouldn't be. The utilitarian calculation is uncomfortable. Unethical experiments led to an intervention that saved millions of lives. Does beneficial outcome justify harmful means? Medical ethicists still debate that question. The Argentina vaccine trials. A pharmaceutical giant needed to test a new vaccine. So they targeted illiterate indigenous families in one of Argentina's poorest provinces. 14 babies died during the trial. The year was 2007. GlaxoSmithKline, a British pharmaceutical company, was developing Synflorix, a pneumococcal vaccine designed to prevent pneumonia and meningitis in children. They needed to compete with Pfizer's similar vaccine, Prevnar. The potential market was worth billions in annual revenue. They chose to conduct their Phase 3 clinical trial, the final testing before approval, in Santiago del Estero province in Argentina. It's one of the country's poorest provinces, predominantly rural with large indigenous communities. Healthcare infrastructure is limited. Between 2007 and 2008, GlaxoSmithKline enrolled approximately 14,000 infants in Argentina, with 24,000 total across Latin America, including Colombia and Panama. The children ranged from 6 weeks to 2 years old. The target population was indigenous families, many speaking Quechua rather than Spanish. Many parents were illiterate or semi-literate. They had limited access to regular health care. Parents were approached in hospital waiting rooms during routine health visits. Some parents later claimed they were told their child needed the vaccine. Others said they were told that participation was required for continued pediatric care. Whether this coercion was systematic or isolated incidents remains disputed. The informed consent process was problematic. Consent forms were written in Spanish, not indigenous languages. Many parents couldn't read the forms at all. The forms used technical medical terminology that exceeded the comprehension level of the target population. Some forms were signed with thumbprints because the parents were illiterate. The critical issue was that parents may not have understood the distinction between an approved vaccine and an experimental trial. They may have been told the vaccine was safe and effective without understanding that it was still being tested and that risks were not fully known. The trial was a randomized controlled study. Some infants received Synflorix. Others received control vaccines for comparison purposes. Parents were required to return for regular monitoring visits. During the trial period, 14 infants died in Argentina. The reported causes included pneumonia, the very disease the vaccine was meant to prevent, as well as meningitis, sudden infant death syndrome, cardiac arrest, and respiratory infections. GlaxoSmithKline's position was that the deaths were unrelated to the vaccine. They argued the deaths were due to the underlying poverty, malnutrition, and endemic disease in the region. The background infant mortality rate in Santiago del Estero is high. In any large trial conducted in a high mortality population, some deaths are statistically expected regardless of the intervention. Critics noted that the high death rate raised questions. Some deaths occurred shortly after vaccination, and poverty doesn't absolve a company of responsibility for how they conduct research. The scientific reality is that establishing definitive causation is difficult. Did the vaccine cause or contribute to the deaths? Or would these infants have died anyway from the conditions endemic to their communities? The answer remains disputed. In 2008, local doctors began raising concerns. Parents started questioning the deaths. Argentine media investigated. In 2012, Argentina's National Drug Regulatory Agency, ANMAT, conducted an investigation. They found protocol violations. The informed consent process was inadequate. Parents had been coerced or misled. Documentation had irregularities. Ethical oversight was insufficient. Criminal charges were filed in 2012 against GlaxoSmithKline executives and local principal investigators. The charges included illegal medical experimentation on humans, fraud, and falsification of public documents. In 2018, an Argentine court ruled that the trial had violated regulations. GlaxoSmithKline was fined approximately $400,000. That's a relatively small amount for a company generating billions in revenue. Some local investigators faced professional sanctions. The outcome of individual criminal cases against GSK executives remains unclear. High-level executives faced no serious consequences. Synflorix was approved by the European Union in 2009 and was WHO pre-qualified. It's now marketed globally and used in childhood immunization programs in many countries. The vaccine generates hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. The vaccine works. Scientific studies show it's effective at preventing pneumococcal disease, but it was developed by testing on illiterate indigenous families who couldn't read the consent forms they signed with their thumbprints. The RotaShield vaccine disaster. A vaccine meant to protect babies from diarrhea instead twisted their intestines inside out. It had been declared completely safe by the FDA. It was on the market for only 9 months before being pulled, but not before over 1 million doses were given. The year was 1998. Wyeth Pharmaceuticals had developed RotaShield, a vaccine designed to prevent rotavirus. Rotavirus causes severe diarrhea in infants and kills over 600,000 children worldwide every year. A vaccine could save lives. In August 1998, the FDA approved RotaShield. It was recommended for routine childhood immunization. Doctors assured parents it was safe and effective. The vaccine had gone through clinical trials involving over 10,000 infants before approval. The target population was all babies, administered at ages 2, 4, and 6 months as part of the standard vaccination schedule. Within months of the vaccine's release, pediatricians and emergency rooms started noticing something disturbing. They were seeing a cluster of cases of intussusception in recently vaccinated infants. Intussusception is a condition where one section of the intestine telescopes into another section, like a collapsing telescope. This creates a blockage. The blood supply to that section of bowel is cut off. The tissue begins to die. The symptoms are severe. Babies experience intense abdominal pain. They scream inconsolably. They vomit. Their stool becomes bloody, sometimes described as resembling red currant jelly. Without prompt treatment, the condition can be fatal. The only treatment is emergency surgery. Doctors have to manually manipulate the intestine back into position, or, in severe cases, remove the damaged section entirely. These are operations being performed on infants under 6 months old. By early 1999, reports of intussusception were accumulating. The CDC's Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System identified a correlation between RotaShield and the condition. Over 100 cases were confirmed. Several deaths were reported. The clinical trials before approval had involved 10,000 infants. Some cases of intussusception had occurred during those trials, but they weren't flagged as statistically significant. The pattern only became apparent after 1.5 million doses had been distributed to the general population. In October 1999, just 9 months after FDA approval, Wyeth voluntarily withdrew RotaShield from the market. No criminal charges were filed. The company withdrew the vaccine before regulatory action was required. Civil lawsuits were filed by families of affected children. The settlement details are largely confidential. The RotaShield disaster led to enhanced post-market vaccine safety monitoring. It demonstrated that even large pre-approval clinical trials can miss rare but serious adverse events. It resulted in stricter requirements for the size and scope of clinical trials before approval. It also showed that modern medicine, even with FDA oversight and rigorous testing standards, can still make catastrophic errors. The difference is in how quickly the system detects and responds to problems. New rotavirus vaccines were eventually developed. Rotatech and Rotarix were approved in 2006 and 2008. These vaccines were extensively tested in much larger trials. No link to intussusception has been found, and they're now part of routine childhood immunization schedules worldwide. But for the parents whose babies required emergency surgery in 1999, the assurances that the vaccine was safe rang hollow. Their children were the ones who revealed the flaw that larger trials should have caught. Nazi medical experiments. The child victims. The Nazi medical experiments are well known, But what's often overlooked is that among the thousands tortured and killed were children, orphans, twins, disabled kids, subjected to the same horrific experiments as adults. Except children suffered more, understood less, and had almost no chance of survival. Between 1937 and 1945, Nazi doctors conducted systematic medical experiments in concentration camps, primarily at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The doctors had medical degrees, institutional authority, and state backing. Among them was Dr. Joseph Mengele, who would become known as the Angel of Death. The victims were Jewish and Romani prisoners. Children were specifically targeted for certain experiments. Twins were Mengele's particular obsession. Disabled children were subjects. Orphans from occupied territories had no one to protect them. When trains arrived at Auschwitz, Mengele personally walked the selection line looking for twins. When he found them, he pulled them aside. The twins were kept in special barracks, given slightly better food than other prisoners, because Mengele needed them alive for his experiments. The twin experiments were systematic. Mengele would perform procedures on one twin and use the other as a control. He transfused blood between twins to see what would happen. He removed organs from one twin to observe the effects. He attempted to surgically conjoin twins by removing limbs and connecting the remaining stumps. He injected chemicals into children's eyes, attempting to change their eye color. The injections caused infections, pain, and sometimes blindness. If one twin died during an experiment, Mengele often had the surviving twin immediately killed so he could perform comparative autopsies. He wanted to examine both bodies at the same time to see the differences. Children were also subjected to the same experiments conducted on adults. Hypothermia experiments involved placing children in tanks of freezing water to test survival times and rewarming methods. Pressure chamber experiments simulated high altitude by rapidly changing air pressure, causing extreme pain and often death. Children were injected with typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases to study disease progression. Almost all surgeries and procedures were performed without anesthesia. The children felt everything. The children couldn't understand what was happening to them. Many cried for parents who were already dead. They had no context for the medical instruments, the repeated procedures, the pain. The exact number of child victims is unknown. Record keeping was deliberately incomplete. Thousands of children were experimented upon. Almost none survived. Nearly all child subjects were killed during the experiments or shortly after when they were no longer useful. When the Soviet Army liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, they found a small number of surviving twins and other child subjects. Dr. Joseph Mengele escaped before liberation. He fled to South America and lived there under assumed names. He was never captured. He died in Brazil in 1979, 34 years after the war ended, without ever facing trial. Other Nazi doctors were prosecuted. The Nuremberg doctors' trial ran from 1946 to 1947. 23 Nazi doctors were tried. 7 were given death sentences and permanently removed. Others received prison sentences. But Mengele, the doctor most associated with child experimentation, lived free until natural death. The Nazi medical experiments directly led to the Nuremberg Code in 1947, the first international document establishing ethical principles for human experimentation. The code established that voluntary informed consent is absolutely essential, that experiments must benefit society, that unnecessary suffering is forbidden, and that no experiment should be conducted if death or disabling injury is expected. The Nuremberg Code became the foundation for the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964 and every subsequent medical ethics regulation. Every institutional review board, every informed consent form, every protection for vulnerable populations in research, all of it traces back to preventing what happened in those camps. The Nazi medical experiments represent the absolute bottom of medical ethics. What happens when doctors abandon their oath to do no harm? Every regulation we've discussed today exists because of what happened to those children.